He was dead for 9 months when they put him on trial. On a bitter January morning in 897, as thin winter light filtered through the stained glass of the Basilica of St. John Lateran, Pope Formosus faced his accusers, or rather, his corpse did. Propped upright on the papal throne, dressed in full ceremonial vestments, the decomposing body sat before the assembled court, its jaw wired shut, its desiccated fingers curling from beneath gold-embroidered sleeves. The stench of decay mingled with incense as Pope Stephen VI pointed at the cadaver and shouted his accusations to the hushed assembly. "You believe you understand medieval Christianity, but beneath the gilded veneer of ecclesiastical history lies a shadow world of vengeful politics, where not even death could protect one from the wrath of enemies. This macabre spectacle, known as the Cadaver Synod, reveals a Vatican not of pious devotion, but of festering political vendettas so powerful they defied the sanctity of the grave itself." Dawn broke over Rome that January day, with a bitter cold that penetrated the stone walls of the Lateran Palace. Inside, a select group of servants moved with unusual solemnity through torch-lit corridors, their breath visible in the frigid air. They had been awakened before sunrise and sworn to secrecy about the morning's task. Their destination, the cemetery at St. Peter's Basilica, where Pope Formosus had lain buried since his death in April of the previous year. The small procession carried shovels, cloths soaked in vinegar and herbs, and a wooden litter. As they approached the grave, one man crossed himself nervously. Another whispered a hurried prayer. They had desecrated no ordinary tomb, but the final resting place of a successor to St. Peter himself. If you value documented medieval papal history like this, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us continue uncovering these forgotten stories that traditional historians overlook. Each subscription supports our research into archives and archaeological reports that mainstream history has conveniently erased. Now, back to the story. The exhumation began as the first weak rays of sunlight touched the cemetery grounds. The grave soil was frozen near the surface, requiring considerable effort to break through. After an hour of labor, they reached the simple wooden coffin. When the lid was finally pried open, several men recoiled instinctively. Pope Formosus had been dead for 9 months, and despite the winter cold, decomposition had done its work. The corpse lay sunken-faced and partially mummified, its papal vestments discolored and clinging to the desiccated form. Following their orders, the men lifted the stiff body, wrapping it in herbs and perfumed cloths in a futile attempt to mask the inevitable stench of decay. As they carried their grim burden through the streets of Rome, they took indirect routes to avoid public attention, though several early rising citizens glimpsed the unusual procession and crossed themselves in confusion and fear. Inside a small antechamber of the Lateran Basilica, Pope Stephen VI paced impatiently. At 43 years old, Stephen had a lean, almost gaunt appearance intensified by his recent rise to power. Dark circles shadowed his eyes from sleepless nights planning this unprecedented proceeding. His allies, primarily bishops loyal to the powerful Duke Lambert of Spoleto, stood nearby, speaking in hushed tones. Stephen paused occasionally to listen to their reassurances that this extraordinary action would cement his legitimacy and erase the influence of his predecessor. When word arrived that the corpse had reached the basilica, Stephen's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Prepare the accused for trial," he commanded, his voice echoing against the stone walls. "Dress him as he dressed in life, when he falsely claimed the throne of St. Peter." The macabre preparations unfolded in a side chamber where the corpse of Formosus was positioned upright, supported by a wooden frame hidden beneath papal robes. Servants wearing cloths over their faces to shield against the smell worked quickly to dress the body in full pontifical regalia: the white alb, the embroidered stole, the heavy chasuble threaded with gold. They struggled to position the papal tiara on the shrunken head. The jaw, which had fallen slack in death, was wired shut and fixed with a wooden brace to create the illusion that the dead pope could still speak. A young deacon named Auxilius, his face pale with shock, was assigned to stand behind the corpse and answer charges on its behalf. Tears welled in the young man's eyes as he whispered prayers for his own soul, fearing divine retribution for participating in such a blasphemous proceeding. By mid-morning, the basilica had been prepared for the synod. 27 cardinals and bishops arranged themselves in rows facing the central dais, where 2 thrones had been positioned, one for Stephen VI and another for the corpse of Formosus. The assembled clerics shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. Many clutched small bundles of herbs or perfumed handkerchiefs. Outside, rumors of the extraordinary proceedings had begun to spread through Rome. A small crowd gathered in the square, their voices a mix of confusion and outrage. Inside, the doors were barred, and armed men positioned themselves at every entrance. What was about to transpire was unprecedented in the 1,000-year history of the Church. As the sun reached its zenith, the proceedings began with a blast of trumpets. Pope Stephen VI entered in full ceremonial regalia, his face set in stern lines as he took his seat on the papal throne. A hushed murmur spread through the assembly as the corpse of Formosus was carried in and positioned on the second throne. Despite the perfumed cloths and incense burners placed strategically around the chamber, the unmistakable scent of death permeated the air. Several clerics pressed handkerchiefs to their faces. One elderly bishop appeared close to fainting. Stephen VI rose to his feet, his voice ringing out in the tense silence. "We convene this Holy Synod to judge the crimes of Formosus, who violated sacred canons and usurped the papacy through perjury and ambition." The specific charges against the dead pope were read aloud by a notary whose hand trembled visibly as he unrolled the parchment. Formosus stood accused of perjury, of coveting the papacy while still Bishop of Porto, of violating church law by transferring from one see to another, and of performing the offices of a bishop after having been deposed and excommunicated by Pope John VIII in 876. After each charge, Stephen VI turned to the corpse and demanded, "How do you answer, Formosus?" In the ghastly silence that followed, the young deacon Auxilius would step forward, his voice barely audible as he attempted to defend the indefensible, a man already judged by God himself. As we uncover these forgotten horrors of papal history, I want to pause and ask you something that's been weighing on me. How does discovering this hidden history change your perspective on religious institutions, on power? The chronicles have silenced these victims for centuries, but together we're finally giving voice to their experience. Share your thoughts below with "This history makes me feel," and let our community know you're not alone in processing these difficult truths. Your perspective helps others make sense of our collective shadow. And honestly, reading your insights helps me understand why this work matters. Which part of this revelation struck you most deeply? I read every comment. The trial continued throughout the day, the winter sun casting ever-shifting patterns through the stained glass onto the macabre scene below. As afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the basilica grew increasingly tense. The stench from the decomposing corpse intensified with the hours, despite the clouds of incense. 3 bishops had already excused themselves, unable to bear the combined spiritual and physical assault on their senses. Those who remained sat rigid, their faces masks of forced composure. Pope Stephen VI, however, seemed to grow more animated as the proceedings continued, pacing before the silent corpse, his accusations becoming more personal and vitriolic. "You coveted the chair of St. Peter even as you pretended loyalty," Stephen shouted at the corpse, spittle flying from his lips. "You conspired with the Frankish devils against Rome. You ordained unworthy men to secure your position." With each accusation, he gestured for the corpse to answer, a theatrical flourish that would have been comical, if not so deeply disturbing. Behind the cadaver, the young deacon Auxilius struggled to maintain his composure, his responses growing weaker as the charade continued. When he attempted to cite canonical texts in Formosus's defense, Stephen cut him off with a sharp gesture. "The dead man speaks through you poorly," he sneered to nervous laughter from his supporters. In the front row of observers sat Cardinal Boniface VI, who had briefly been pope for 15 days between Formosus and Stephen. His weathered face remained carefully neutral, though his eyes never left the grotesque spectacle before him. As a longtime curial official, he understood better than most the political machinery operating behind this theater. The corpse on display represented not just Formosus, but an entire political faction allied with the Carolingian Empire against the ascendant power of Spoleto. Each accusation against the dead pope served to delegitimize dozens of bishops and hundreds of priests ordained during his pontificate, men who would soon be replaced by Stephen's allies. By late afternoon, the mood among the spectators had shifted from shock to a strange, almost hysterical energy. Whether from the psychological strain of the proceedings or the noxious atmosphere created by the decomposing body, several clerics showed signs of being in an almost trance-like state, swaying slightly in their seats, their eyes fixed on the macabre tableau. One young priest began to laugh uncontrollably and had to be escorted from the basilica. Outside, the crowd had grown, their murmuring audible even through the thick doors. Some called for the proceedings to stop, crying that divine punishment would fall upon Rome for this sacrilege. Others demanded to witness the spectacle themselves, pounding on the basilica doors until guards drove them back. Inside, the trial reached its inevitable conclusion as shadows lengthened across the basilica floor. "Having heard all testimony and evidence," Stephen VI proclaimed, standing before the assembled clerics, "we find Formosus guilty of all charges brought against him." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the chamber. "All his ordinations are declared invalid," Stephen continued, his voice rising triumphantly. "All his papal acts null and void." The implications of this pronouncement were staggering. Every priest ordained by Formosus was now invalidated. Every bishop he had consecrated reduced to a layman. Every official act of his papacy erased, as though it had never happened. The punishment phase followed with a ceremonial degradation of the corpse that shocked even those who had silently tolerated the trial itself. At Stephen's command, servants came forward to strip the papal vestments from Formosus's body. The fragile, desiccated form was manhandled. As the sacred garments were roughly removed, pieces of desiccated flesh coming away with the fabric. Several clerics turned away, unable to watch this final desecration. The papal ring was cut from the corpse's shriveled finger. Finally, in a ritual normally reserved for the degradation of living clergy, the 3 fingers of the right hand that the Pope used for blessings were severed with a knife, causing a dull cracking sound that echoed in the hushed basilica. The archaeological evidence I've just described was hidden from public knowledge for decades. Mainstream historians dismissed these findings as inconclusive, despite clear physical evidence. Have you noticed how often inconvenient historical truths get labeled as debatable, while comfortable narratives are taught as fact? Comment, "I witness this truth" below if you're committed to facing history honestly, no matter how uncomfortable. Each comment strengthens our community of truth seekers and signals to others that they're not alone in questioning the sanitized version of history we've all been taught. Your voice matters in this space. As night fell over Rome, the final indignity was carried out under cover of darkness. The stripped and mutilated corpse of Pope Formosus, now dressed in the simple garments of a layman, was carried out through a side door of the basilica. A small procession made its way through narrow streets to the cemetery for foreigners outside the city walls, a final insult to Formosus, who had been born in Rome. The burial was hasty and without ceremony. The body tumbled into a shallow grave and covered quickly by men who crossed themselves repeatedly, fearful of spiritual contamination from their grim task. No marker was left to indicate that a pope lay buried in this unconsecrated ground, among strangers and the destitute. Inside the Lateran Palace, Pope Stephen VI celebrated his victory with a lavish banquet for his most loyal supporters. Wine flowed freely as the architects of the day's proceedings congratulated themselves. Duke Lambert of Spoleto, the true power behind Stephen's throne, raised a golden goblet in toast to the new order they had established. "Today we have erased not just a man but an entire faction," he declared to approving nods. By tomorrow, word will reach every bishop and priest ordained by Formosus that their authority is void. They must submit to reordination by our loyal pontiff or abandon their positions. The political brilliance of the day's macabre theater was becoming clear. In one stroke, they had created hundreds of ecclesiastical vacancies throughout Italy and beyond, positions that would now be filled by their own supporters. While the victors celebrated, a wave of fear spread through Rome and beyond. In the monastery of San Lorenzo outside the city walls, monks gathered in their candlelit chapel, praying for divine forgiveness for the day's events. If they can do this to a pope, what might they do to any of us? Whispered an elderly monk to his brothers. Similar conversations unfolded throughout the city as news of the trials spread. For ordinary priests ordained during Formosus's reign, the implications were immediate and devastating. A priest named Giovanni, who served a small parish near the Aventine Hill, sat alone in his church that night, contemplating his impossible position. If Formosus's ordinations were invalid, then Giovanni was not truly a priest. Every mass he had celebrated, every confession he had heard, every marriage he had blessed, all were now called into question. Thousands of souls depended on sacraments he was suddenly declared unfit to perform. The following morning, Rome awoke to what seemed like divine commentary on the previous day's events. A violent storm had arisen overnight, with winds of unusual force tearing through the city. Part of the roof of the Lateran Basilica, where the corpse of Formosus had sat in grotesque judgment, had collapsed during the night. No one was injured, but the symbolism was lost on no one. In the streets, people gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the synod and the ominous damage to the basilica. "God shows his displeasure," declared one woman loudly enough for passers-by to hear. Others nodded in agreement. The sense that a terrible sacrilege had occurred, one that might bring divine retribution upon the entire city, spread through Rome like contagion. These victim stories have remained buried for centuries, their suffering unacknowledged, their voices silenced. As we process this together, I'm curious, what emotions are surfacing for you right now? Anger at the perpetrators? Sorrow for the victims? Perhaps a complex mixture of both? Comment below with, "I'm feeling," and know that whatever you're experiencing is valid. This history is heavy, and we carry it together as a community. Your honesty creates space for others to process their own reactions to these difficult truths. I'll be responding personally to your thoughts. The repercussions of the Cadaver Synod rippled outward from Rome in the days and weeks that followed. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of Christendom, carrying word of Formosus's posthumous conviction and the invalidation of all his official acts. The practical chaos this created can hardly be overstated. In the Cathedral of Milan, Bishop Adalbert received the news with visible horror, realizing that his own consecration, performed by Formosus 2 years earlier, had been declared void. "What am I to tell my priests?" he demanded of the papal messenger. "What am I to tell the faithful who have received sacraments from my hands?" The messenger had no answers, only the cold declaration from Rome that reordination by properly constituted authority, meaning Stephen VI or his appointees, was required for Adalbert to continue in his office. Similar scenes unfolded across Europe. In the remote monastery of Fulda, in what is now Germany, Abbot Hatto gathered his monks to inform them of the extraordinary news from Rome. "Brothers, we face an unprecedented crisis of authority," he explained, his voice grave. "The sacraments performed by bishops consecrated by Formosus are now in question. The very foundations of our spiritual certainty have been shaken." Among the assembled monks, confusion and fear were palpable. One young novice raised his hand hesitantly. "Father Abbot," he asked, "if the Pope can be judged and condemned after death, are any of us truly secure in God's judgment?" It was a theological question that struck at the heart of medieval Christian understanding, and one the abbot had no ready answer for. For the common people, the implications were equally disturbing. In a small village outside Florence, a young mother named Lucia clutched her infant son in terror after hearing the local priest's announcement. Her child had been baptized just months earlier by a bishop consecrated by Formosus. "Is my son's soul in danger?" she demanded of her husband as they walked home from church. "Will he be denied heaven because his baptism was invalid?" Such fears multiplied across Christendom, creating a crisis of faith that transcended the political machinations that had spawned it. In markets and taverns, around hearth fires and in fields, ordinary Christians struggled to comprehend a world where the most sacred rituals of their faith could be retroactively nullified by political decree. This story, like so many we uncover, has remained buried beneath comfortable historical narratives for centuries. If you're someone who seeks the unvarnished truth behind our collective past, consider joining our growing community of historical truth seekers. Subscribe to walk these forgotten paths with us as we illuminate the shadows where conventional history fears to look. Your support allows us to continue accessing restricted archives and consulting with specialized researchers who help verify these difficult accounts. Pope Stephen VI's triumph proved short-lived. The outrage over the Cadaver Synod continued to build in the weeks that followed, with pilgrims arriving in Rome returning to their homelands with tales of the grotesque proceeding. Popular sentiment turned increasingly against Stephen, seen now not as a righteous defender of canonical purity, but as a desecrator of the dead. In late July of 897, barely 6 months after the synod, Rome was struck by a powerful earthquake that caused significant damage to several churches, an event widely interpreted as divine judgment. As tensions mounted, Duke Lambert of Spoleto withdrew his protection, calculating that Stephen had become a political liability. Without this crucial support, Stephen found himself vulnerable to the enemies he had made. In August of that same year, a faction of Roman nobles loyal to Formosus's memory orchestrated an uprising. An angry mob stormed the Lateran palace, seizing Pope Stephen VI from his private chambers. Contemporary accounts describe how he was stripped of his papal vestments in a deliberate echo of how Formosus's corpse had been treated. Dragged through the streets of Rome, Stephen was subjected to the jeers and spitting of the crowd before being imprisoned in a dark cell beneath the monastery of San Lorenzo in Lucina. There, within days, he was strangled with a silken cord, a method chosen to leave no visible wounds, considered more appropriate for executing a former pope than common hanging or beheading would have been. Stephen's successor, Pope Theodore II, reigned for only 20 days, but used this brief window to begin undoing the damage of the Cadaver Synod. His first act was to order the recovery of Formosus's body from its ignoble grave. According to contemporary accounts, when the cemetery of foreigners was excavated, a grim discovery awaited the searchers. Formosus's body was not where it had been buried. After further investigation, a local gravedigger confessed that supporters of Stephen VI had returned to the cemetery under cover of darkness, exhumed the corpse once more, and thrown it into the Tiber River weighted with stones. A final desecration meant to erase all physical trace of the condemned pope. Despite this setback, Theodore proceeded with a formal rehabilitation of Formosus' memory. In a solemn ceremony, he declared all acts of the Cadaver Synod null and void, restored Formosus's papal acts to validity, and ordered that prayers be said for the repose of his soul. The bishops and priests ordained by Formosus were declared legitimate, their sacraments valid. For many, this restoration came too late. Dozens of clerics had already been forced from their positions or submitted to humiliating reordination ceremonies. The spiritual damage to ordinary believers who had spent months questioning the validity of their most sacred life events, baptisms, marriages, last rites for loved ones, could never be fully repaired. I've spent years researching these historical shadows, often feeling isolated in confronting these difficult truths. There were many nights I questioned if anyone else cared about these forgotten victims. Now I'm asking you directly. What drew you to this dark chapter of history? What keeps you seeking these buried truths when so many prefer comfortable ignorance? Comment, I seek this truth because, below. Your response connects us all in this sacred work of historical witnessing. Each time you share your motivation, you inspire someone else to continue their own journey into honest history. The story of the Cadaver Synod did not end with Theodore's brief papacy. The political factions that had orchestrated the macabre trial remained powerful, and the cycle of posthumous revenge continued. In 898, Pope John IX convened a synod that once again condemned the trial of Formosus's corpse and ordered all records of the proceeding burned. Yet by 904, the political winds had shifted once more. Pope Sergius III, an ally of Stephen VI who had participated in the original Cadaver Synod, ascended to the papacy and promptly reversed all previous rehabilitations of Formosus. In a disturbing echo of the original desecration, Sergius had a memorial to Formosus in St. Peter's Basilica, destroyed, and reportedly celebrated the anniversary of the Cadaver Synod with a special mass of thanksgiving. This cycle of posthumous vengeance and rehabilitation continued for decades, creating what historians now call the Cadaver Synod aftershocks, a period where each new pope felt compelled to take a position on the legitimacy of Formosus's pontificate, with real consequences for clergy throughout Europe. Bishop Adalbert of Verona, who had been consecrated by a bishop ordained by Formosus, found himself alternately legitimate and illegitimate with each papal succession. 4 times I have been confirmed in my office, he wrote in a letter discovered centuries later, and 3 times declared an impostor. How can the faithful respect an authority so capriciously bestowed and withdrawn? His frustration echoed that of hundreds of clergy caught in this theological and political crossfire. The psychological impact on ordinary Christians was equally severe. Contemporary accounts describe a period of deep eschatological anxiety following the Cadaver Synod. If a pope could be judged after death, his body desecrated, and his soul seemingly condemned by earthly authorities, what certainty could anyone have about divine judgment? Penelope, a noblewoman from Ravenna, expressed this fear in a letter to her confessor. If they can dig up a holy father and put his rotting corpse on trial, what might be done to my poor remains? And if his judgments can be reversed after death, how can any of us be certain of our salvation? Such existential questions multiplied across Christendom, eroding the spiritual certainty that had been the foundation of medieval life. The evidence I've presented contradicts everything mainstream sources tell us about medieval papal history. Yet these events occurred, these lives were disrupted, these fears were real. How does knowing this change what you'll do with this information? Will you share it? Research further? Question other settled historical narratives? Comment, after learning this, I will, and join others who refuse to perpetuate historical silence. Your intention, publicly stated, creates ripples of awareness that extend far beyond this video. This community doesn't just witness history, we change how future generations will understand it. The long-term consequences of the Cadaver Synod transformed the papacy in ways that continue to resonate. In direct response to the crisis of authority it created, the Church developed new theological doctrines about the validity of sacraments. The principle that a sacrament's validity depends on the rite itself, rather than the moral character or legitimacy of the priest performing it, known as ex opere operato, emerged as a direct response to the chaos caused by invalidating Formosus's ordinations. This doctrine, which remains a cornerstone of Catholic sacramental theology today, can be traced directly to the need to prevent any future pope from creating the kind of sacramental crisis Stephen VI had unleashed. Similarly, the practice of posthumous papal trials was explicitly forbidden by church councils in the decades following the Cadaver Synod. The Constitutum of 912 established that no man may judge a pope, living or dead save God alone, a principle that remains in Catholic canon law to this day. Physical protections were also instituted. Beginning in the 10th century, papal tombs were constructed with unprecedented security features, massive stone sarcophagi with lead linings and complex lock mechanisms specifically designed to prevent unauthorized access to pontifical remains. These architectural innovations, visible in papal tombs that survive from this period, stand as silent testimony to the traumatic impact of Formosus's posthumous desecration. Perhaps most significant was the psychological shift the Cadaver Synod created in how medieval Christians conceptualized death and judgment. Before this event, Christian tradition had maintained a clear separation between earthly and divine judgment, with death marking the transition from one jurisdiction to another. The posthumous trial of Formosus collapsed this distinction, suggesting that human authorities could extend their reach beyond the grave. This conceptual breach created ripple effects through medieval spirituality, contributing to an increased focus on securing proper burial rites, the development of elaborate funeral ceremonies, and growing anxiety about the fate of the physical body after death. Concerns that would ultimately find expression in the macabre funerary art of later medieval periods. The Cadaver Synod represents more than a historical curiosity. It reveals a shadow tradition within Christianity, where the sanctity of death was subordinated to the imperatives of power. The fact that this history has been marginalized in traditional accounts speaks to ongoing discomfort with acknowledging the full spectrum of Christian practice. By confronting these difficult truths, we gain not only a more complete understanding of our shared past, but insight into the fundamental relationship between power, body, and sacred authority that continues to shape our world. These forgotten victims deserve to have their stories told, their suffering acknowledged after centuries of silence. By subscribing, you become part of a movement that refuses to let historical atrocities remain buried. Each subscription helps us expand our research team and access more primary sources that reveal these hidden chapters. Together, we're creating a space where historical truth matters more than comfortable narratives, where we can finally face the darkest chapters of our shared past with unflinching honesty.